understand physical activity behaviour, and we try and bring it to life and present it to people to try and influence decision making. And basically, we help Active Knots with that part of their work. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to run through some of the adult physical activity data for Nottingham City. I've got a series of slides. I'm going to try and bring that to life for you. I'm going to try and connect it to things that we might need to think about changing towards the end. Yeah, and the easiest way of doing this is if you've got any questions, if you want to pop them in the chat as we go along, and if I can answer them, if they're about kind of like the data or trying to understand the data, if I can answer them as I go along, I will, and if not, we can pick them up at the end if that's okay. Okay, what I'm going to cover today, just so you know, is I'm going to cover a little bit about the overall trends, what's happening over time in terms of adult physical activity levels in Nottingham City. I'm going to start with a little bit of information about the census. You probably think it's such a boring chunk of information, but we love the census, and I'll explain why when I get there. And then I'm going to show you different parts of the kind of Nottingham community that experience being active or not in very different ways, and just going to dig into that demographics a little bit. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the minutes. Where do we get our minutes from? Is it from walking? Is it from playing sport? What does that kind of look like, and what's the trends there? So yeah, let's get into it. Just to as a kind of framing kind of concept, I'm going to just share this this slide with you that's come from some work that a lady called Dr. Katie Shern is doing as part of the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership that's working with Sport England. And what this slide does is just help us think about the data that I'm presenting to you. And I want you to start on the right of the slide, changes in population level outcomes. That's what I'm talking about today, physical activity behaviour. What's it look like across the whole of the adult population in Nottingham? Is it going up? Is it going down? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? What are the inequalities looking like? That's the space I'm going to explore. And it's in our sphere of interest. Katie's articulated it as being in our sphere of interest, not in our sphere of direct intervention, which is obviously towards the left of this screen. Well, why is that? Well, the reason why it's in that sphere of interest is there's many different influences of population level physical activity, where the green space is and whether people can get in and out of it and utilize it, what things are available to people, what's the state of the footpaths and the pavements, and can people use them to walk and wheel and cycle, what's the state of active transport links, and so on and so forth. All of these things, as well as our own personal demographics and our own personal motivations, influence whether our population is active or not. And so just remember that we're talking about this data represents this outcome level data that has many, many different influences to it. And I'll come back to some latest learning that can help us start to think about how we can unpick that right at the end. Okay, moving on to the census. We love the census in Press Red. If your households would have probably completed it, if you remember, March 2021, and we were in the middle of a lockdown. So this was the second lockdown, I think, if I recall correctly. And so this chunk of data is a bit unique in that sense, because I think it's the first time that a census has ever been undertaken in a national lockdown. And so it's got some really interesting quirks in it. But the three things that I want to kind of point out today, and I want you to keep in your head when we go and look at some of the other data, is that the population of the city is growing. We are getting more people. This is the left-hand kind of circle. So the 16 plus population, now around 260,000 people over the age of 16. And that's grown by 6% between 2011 and 2021. Okay, so between 2011 and 2021 censuses, there's been a 6% growth in the number of people, and we're now up to 260,000 people. Okay, that trend is predicted to continue for the next 10, 20 years. Nottingham City is going to continue to get bigger in terms of the number of people living there. The second trend in the middle, we're aging. The whole of the country is aging. The reason why is a generation called the baby boomer generation, born post-war, and a very big increase in birth rates. And that generation is now over the age of 55. And so what we've got is we've got a growing aging population. What does that mean in Nottingham? Well, between 2011 and 2021, there's been a 12% increase in the number of people over the age of 55. Notice that that increase is double what's happened to the population generally. Okay, so we're getting more older people making up the population. That change, that 12%, isn't quite as quick as what's happening nationally. Nationally, that growth is about 18% in that over 55 population. That's because Nottingham's a young city. You get a lot of students there. A lot of young people come to Nottingham City to find work. That trend again is predicted to continue for the next 10 to 20 years. We're going to continue to get more older people in the Nottingham population. And then the third one, the city's becoming more diverse. Our culturally diverse communities are getting bigger. It's over 100,000 people now that identify from culturally diverse communities. That growth of 31% between 2011 and 2021 is actually a bit slower than England, but that's because Nottingham's already much more diverse than England. And so we've got these three trends that are going to continue. Okay, and I want you to keep that in mind when we start to look at the data, because we know that some of these groups, like older people, for example, find it harder to be more active, to be active, and we're going to be getting more of them. So we're going to have to start thinking about what that means for our infrastructure and our delivery and the way that we go about our work. I'm going to be using one term in particular, inactive, quite a bit in the next few slides. What on earth am I on about? Well, the chief medical officers for the UK recommend that adults do 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity per week. Okay, I've used that term moderate intensity for a reason, and I will come back to it later. Okay, if we're doing over 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity, we are active and we're meeting the chief medical officer's recommendation. And the Active Life survey that is commissioned by government and Sport England and the Department of Transport measures that indicator, who's achieving 150 minutes or more. Okay, if we're doing fewer than 30 minutes, less than 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity in the week, then we're being deemed as inactive. It's not quite as simple as that, and I will come back to that a little bit later. But I'm going to spend most of my time talking about that inactive group and who is it within the Nottingham population that tends to fall into that group of doing less than 30 minutes moderate intensity. Let me just show you some of the data to try and bring this to life. We have got 7 years of data for adults now, starting back in 2015-16, all the way through to November 2022. And what you've got here, we love wiggly worms in press red, and what you've got here is basically the years of data plotted for each of the 7. The red dot at the bottom is the proportion of inactive people. That's the proportion of adults in Nottingham that are doing less than 30 minutes for physical activity a week. And you can see how it's changed over the 7 years. The green dots at the top that have been joined together is the proportion of people that are achieving 150 minutes. That's the proportion that are achieving the chief medical officer's recommendation. The black lines that they interweave with, that's the data for England. Okay, and it's not really fair comparing Nottingham City to England for a couple of reasons. I've already mentioned Nottingham City is quite a bit younger, got more younger people in its population than England does, as an average. It's also got more culturally diverse communities, and it's also got more people from lower socioeconomic communities living on a lower income. And I'll come back to that group and I'll say a little bit more about it a little bit later. But I just want you to observe the pattern in the red line at the bottom to begin with. Look at how pre-pandemic it was slowly heading down. We want it to be going down. We want it to be getting lower. We want that number to be going down. Then the pandemic came along and pushed it right back up to where it was at the baseline. Okay, and then in the last couple of years, it's slowly almost returned back to where it was pre-pandemic, but it's pretty much in line with pre-pandemic levels now. We know the pandemic came along and disrupted behavior big time. Of course it did. We were told we couldn't go out. Things were taken away. Leisure centres were shut. Sports clubs were shut. Provision was stopped. We were told for big periods of time in different parts of the country that we could only go outside for an hour. And a lot of us use that to walk. And I'll show you that in the data a little bit later. So, of course, it's going to have impacted. And it's taking a bit of time in the city to get back to where it was. What we've got to try and do is keep encouraging it, trying to learn about how we can keep encouraging it back in the direction that we want it to go. What's positive is in the last 12 months between 2021, 22, it's gone in the right direction. 3% increase for activity levels, 2% decrease in inactivity. Both of those are going in the right direction, which is really positive. But that 26% is still quite a lot of people. Okay, around 68,000 adults over the age of 16 that are not active or are actually inactive and are doing less than 30 minutes. But that term inactive is a little bit unfair, and I'll explain why with this slide. Okay, because you can think about that inactive group and you can think it's people that are just not doing 30 minutes. Well, there's a group within this 26%, around 17%, so 46,000 adults that are not really moving at all. They're doing very little movement, and that is the biggest group. But look at the group in the middle. Okay, this is 19,000 people, which is not a small number, around 7% of the city's population, adult population, and they're missing the intensity. What on earth does that mean? Well, that little phrase that I used earlier, moderate intensity, the reason why it's in the Chief Medical Officer's recommendations is because to get the full benefit of moving, we need to get our heart up. We need to get our heart rate going up to get cardiovascular health benefits from it. It doesn't have, and I'm not talking Joe Wicks HIIT sessions here or sprinting. I'm talking a brisk walk. For the vast majority of people, this will be a brisk walk, and you will get your heart rate high enough to be hitting moderate intensity. Okay, so keep that in mind. And we've got 19,000 people that are falling into the inactive group because they're missing the intensity. What does that actually mean in practice? Think of people walking not brisk enough. Think of people gardening. Think of some low impact, low intensity activities that people might do to stay healthy, and they might get mental well-being and benefits from just moving, because any movement's better than no movement. But we've got a group of people that are potentially doing a lot of movement. Some people in this group are doing hours of physical activity. But they're not getting the heart rate up, so they're not getting the cardiovascular benefit. And this is all worked out through the survey. And the reason why I'm labouring this point, sorry, the other group on the slide is the group that are doing between 1 and 29 minutes of moderate intensity, so they're just not getting enough minutes. The reason why I'm labouring this slide is because my view is the group on the left that are potentially quite sedentary, and the other two groups that are on the right potentially need very different tactics. The group that are doing already active but not getting the heart rate up, potentially open to campaigning and getting some messaging across and thinking about how we can raise awareness of the need to move a little bit brisker to get the cardiovascular benefits. The group on the left probably needs some kind of intervention in some kind of way and some support. Some of those people will be habitually inactive, and so we need to be thinking a bit more nuanced when we talk about this group that's inactive. The bit that I want to just point out here, it's a real quirk in the data, and it is what it is, and it's not as easy to tease out at times. Look at the footnotes. There's a little phrase in the footnotes on here that it says excluding gardening. What does that mean? Well, some of the data that I'm going to be presenting today, it hasn't got the minutes from gardening in it, because Sport England give us the data set without that data in it, and so we have to, and this is the data set that Sport England use. So if you're going to Sport England for investment, they want to see these figures because it's in line with the figures that they use. If you go onto Nottingham City's public health website, and you'll find some data on there, the data on there will be a little bit different to the data in this slide deck. And the reason for that is public health use the data including gardening minutes. Gardening reduces inactivity levels. Of course it does. It does that across the country. Places like Nottingham City, it might not make as big an impact because not many people will have gardens in built-up urban areas. So that will absolutely be at play. But it's an important thing to just keep in mind, especially when we talk about some of the groups. And there is a slide later on where I'll just say a little bit more about gardening, but it's quite important to just keep that in your head. Let's just move on to thinking about getting underneath this thing. So we've got this situation where the pandemic's come along, it's made things worse, but we're starting to see things returning to normal. That's happening in the city, and it's also happening in England as a bit of an unfair comparator. But we know that activity levels are affected by, or play out differently for different demographic groups. And these are 4 groups that I'm going to be showing you a little bit of information on, just to show you the situation currently in the latest data that we've got. The really interesting one on here is three of these, we'd expect them to a degree. The really interesting one on here is the first one, age. And actually the pandemic in the city seems to have had a little bit more of a negative impact on our younger adult population than our older adult population. How can I show you this? Okay, what you're looking at here across the bottom is the life course. Okay, so that's age, these different age groups, roughly about 5-year age groups till we get to the over 85s, and then it's just the over 85s. And the grey line is the proportion of inactive for each of those groups as an average pre-pandemic. So we've taken all of the years of data pre-pandemic, added it all together, and then we've basically plotted the level of inactivity. Okay. And then the red line is we've basically taken the 3 years of data that we've had since the pandemic came along, and we've plotted that, and we've plotted it across the life course, and you've got these values for the kind of average inactivity since the pandemic came along. And you can see that the gap where the red line is above the grey line, it means that inactivity is higher than it was pre-pandemic. And you can see that the gap is mainly pre-55, which is really interesting. And actually post 55, it's pretty consistent with itself, which is quite interesting. So the younger adults in the city seem to have had a bit more of a negative impact from the pandemic than the older adults. Why is that? Well, go back to some of the things that I've been mentioning already. Younger adults, what are they more likely to get their minutes from? Sport, fitness, things that are provided, things that stopped during the pandemic, and some of it may have come back. Some of that group will have found other ways of being active, and I'll come back to that a little bit later. What are the older age group more likely to get their minutes through? Walking and gardening. What are the 2 things that we could have done through the pandemic? We could walk and garden. And it seems that would have been at play a little bit in the city. I can't say that for sure, but we've certainly got this pattern where younger adults seem to have found being active a little bit more challenging since the pandemic came along. I'm flagging this because I think that gap's not enormous, apart from the 50 to 54-year-olds, where there is a really big gap right now. Some of these gaps are quite a bit bigger. We need to keep our eye on this. My sense is it's a pretty young city. This will probably naturally over time go back to where it was, but we do need to keep an eye on it over time, because I think it's becoming important. We don't want our younger adults, who are more likely to be active, to start to fall into inactivity earlier. It's just going to create health problems and other issues further down the line. Okay, I'm going to move on to that second group now, around lower socioeconomic communities or lower income communities. This term, NSEC 6 to 8, is a very boring status term that comes from the census. The census asks us a series of questions like, who's the chief income earner in the household? How much do they earn? What kind of job do they do? What kind of qualifications do they have? How many people are they responsible for in their job, so on and so forth. And the Office of National Statistics take those answers to those questions, and they put every household in the country into 1 to 9 socioeconomic groups, NSEC 1 to 9. Okay, NSEC 1 and 2 are people that are chief executives, professionally qualified people like doctors, accountants, lawyers, so on and so forth, more likely to be higher income, more likely to be higher level qualifications, more likely to be responsible for managing bigger organizations. NSEC 6 to 8, which is the other group you've got on this slide, are people in routine and semi-routine work and long-term unemployed, and never worked in long-term unemployed. The routine and semi-routine work, just to try and bring that to life for you, it's people in cleaning roles, working on retail floors in shops, working on production lines, labourers, that kind of job. And what you've got here is you've got inactive for the NSEC 1 to 2, so the doctors and lawyers, and that's the light grey tower, and you can see how that's gone up in the pandemic. More likely to play sport, more likely to be reliant on provision and taking part in things. NSEC 6 to 8 are the dark grey black towers, and you can see how that's been went up a little bit in the pandemic, but it's pretty stably high. And we've had an inequality between these groups for a very, very long time. I'm going to put a big caveat on it. Not caveat's the wrong word. I'm going to make a big observation on this, which I think is really important to try and understand locally. This survey does not ask people about minutes done at work. Okay, it just doesn't go there. Now, minutes done at work are challenging because there's mixed evidence about the benefit of them, but they technically count towards the Chief Medical Officer's recommendation, but they're not captured by this survey. People that are in NSEC 6 to 8 jobs, what they're more likely to be doing? Manual labour. Okay, and this survey isn't taking that into account. And I think the thing that I'd like you to get into your head is you're a cleaner on your feet all day, moving around office blocks in the city. How much are you're probably working quite long hours as well. How are you going to feel like getting home and doing some more physical activity? You know, my mum used to work on a market stall, and as soon as she got home, she just wanted to sit down. She'd been stood up for 8, 10, 12 hours, however long the day was. And then what did she want to do? And she just wanted to take the weight off her feet. Okay. We do not understand that situation well enough, and this data does not help us. And so in some of the communities that you'll be working with, trying to influence behavior around, thinking about, this is a place for us to try and build up our understanding, because it's not a particularly strong area when it comes to current research, and really trying to build a better picture of what it's like when you're in a manual job and then trying to be active as well. Some people manage to achieve it. Remember, this is not the 65% currently that are not inactive, so in that NSX 6 to 8, so people manage to achieve it. So how do we start to understand this data a little bit better is a big thing for us going forward. Moving on to our culturally diverse communities. Again, we've done a similar thing here. We've had to aggregate the years of data to be able to get a big enough sample and to be able to bring it to life. The light grey tower is the average inactivity levels for these different culturally diverse groups. And then the red tower is the average since the pandemic came along. And you can see that the pandemic has pushed up inactivity amongst the Asian community and amongst this other ethnic group. Interestingly, the Black community inactivities drop, which is really positive. If we can keep that kind of trend going, that'd be a really great result. And you can see that inactivity has risen a point or two within the white British community as well. My concern here, and we've seen this nationally, this isn't just a Nottingham challenge, it's a challenge nationally, that the Asian community have certainly seemed to be experiencing higher levels of inactivity since the pandemic arrived. There's a lot of cultural sensitive dynamics within the parts of the Asian community that we need to be conscious of. You know, some really interesting work in Derby City with the Pakistani community, for example, in Normanton. And it's been really fascinating just kind of trying to surface what's been going on in those communities as the pandemic's kind of unfolded, and the implications that has for trying to live well and be active. I think this is another really important part of this work. How well do we understand the different cultural influences of our diverse communities? It's something that we really need to build around this data. Last demographic group, just moving on to people with a limited illness and disability. Again, we've got a long-standing inequality here. Right now, it's quite wide, which is interesting. You can see what the pandemic did for people with a limited illness and disability. It pushed inactivity up from the pre-pandemic year, 18-19. It pushed it back up to where it was pretty much at baseline, and it stayed up there. We're not seeing the same return to activity amongst this group in the city as we are with the population as a whole. You can see the black line. That's inactivity for people without a long-term illness or disability, and you can see how that has bounced back all the way to pre-pandemic levels, which is great. But we're now getting the part of our community that are living with a limited illness or disability experiencing higher levels of inactivity, and that inequality is quite wide right now. So our attention needs to be continuing to be thinking about how we understand and support that group. Little bit now on where we get our minutes from. Okay, really boring chart this, but it's quite important in a way. What are you looking at? I want you to imagine all of the minutes done by adults in Nottingham. All of them. however they are, whether they're from traditional sport, fitness, dancing, gardening, cycling, walking for leisure, walking for travel, however they're done, apart from work, they're in this chart. Okay, and what's it showing us? Well, it's showing us that peak minutes on average per person was 2017-18. The pandemic's come along and it's gone down, but it hasn't gone down that much. And remember that inactivity jumped quite a bit. How does that work? I'll come to that in a second. And then in the latest year, the average minutes have jumped back up to almost the highest that they've been again. And our activity levels have increased, remember, 3 percentage points. So that's good. But what we saw in the pandemic, which is quite interesting, is not everywhere, this average minutes didn't change a lot in most places. How can that be when we saw activity levels, more people doing nothing, but average minutes staying pretty stable? Yeah, it's gone down a little bit, but not huge. And the answer to that is people that found themselves with more time on their hand because they were working from home did more. And so we saw for some people, average minutes really went up because they had more flexibility in their working day. They weren't driving to and from work, so on and so forth. And so we've got this situation where we've got a bigger group of people doing nothing, and then we've got a pretty big group of people also doing more minutes, which meant the average minutes were pretty stable. The important bit I think about this chart is that traditional sport minutes have gone back to where they were pre-pandemic, and minutes from traditional sport are pretty important to some groups. They really are important, particularly to younger adults, middle and high socioeconomic groups, low socioeconomic groups as well. Black and Asian communities often rely more on traditional sport minutes than they do on walking, and I'll pick up on that in a minute or two. And so that returning back to where it was is really important. But those minutes are still quite small when you start to compare it to walking. So I'm going to just show you build on that slide a little bit by showing you a similar kind of data for walking. What you've got here now is basically the average minutes for walking for leisure is the light blue kind of mountain range or strata or whatever you want to call that at the bottom. And you can see from the pandemic where it had hit its lowest point. So average minutes in Nottingham City were at their lowest that we've got the data for in 2018-19. Then the pandemic came along. We were told we couldn't go out apart from for an hour, and people like me used that hour to teach my children because that's about the only thing I could teach. And look at the minutes go up and go up and still going up, even though we've got traditional sport minutes going up as well. The really positive bit about this, and we haven't seen this everywhere, is the walking for travel. You can see how it got squeezed in the early part of the pandemic, but it is showing signs of coming back. Okay, it's really important walking for travel. Who's more likely to walk for travel? Lower socioeconomic communities because they don't have a car. Okay, and in some parts of the country, walking for travel minutes disappeared off the edge of a cliff. And some parts of the country, they're not bouncing back yet. Nottingham, they are. Younger adults do quite a bit of walking for travel, often don't own cars. Lower socioeconomic groups, parts of our diverse communities are more likely to get minutes walking for travel. Okay, this whole situation is interesting. Just talking to working with the Pakistani community in Derby, and the conversation there around how a lot of the pattern that's kind of accepted within that part of the community is something to go to, something to do, go and play sport, go and be active doing something, less interested in walking around the neighborhood. Why? Racism. Experiences of public transport and the conversations that we had with people in that part of the community avoided public transport like the plague if they could, because that's where racism often occurred. That's where people would share experiences of being abused, which then sets a behavior, doesn't it? Avoid it. Really interesting conversation around why everybody drives to the mosque in one particular part of Normanton, and the group that we're talking to, a group of men not even realizing what they were doing when I was asking questions like, you live like 400 or 500 meters away and you're driving to the mosque? Help me understand that. And there's a whole conversation came out around status, came out around safety, came out again around avoiding potential abusive situations in traditional dress. So there's some really interesting things for us to start to think about, because walking For white British people, it gives us roughly half of our minutes. But it's such a big part of our minutes. One of the big gaps in inequalities is white British people get a lot more minutes from walking for leisure in particular than our culturally diverse communities. Okay, we're going to have to think that through. We're going to have to try and work that through if we want to see change, and try and explore what that needs to look like going forward. Just something very briefly on, and I was hoping to show you a wonderful map of the city, because there's some great data about to arrive from Sport England. We haven't got it yet, sadly, but when it does, it's going to really help your work if you're in particular parts of the city, because what they're going to do is they are going to model levels of activity, inactive and active, down to a very small geographic level. Okay, think parts of the city where up to 5,000 people live. Okay, so in some parts of the city, it's going to be a really small area. And that data is imminent. And when we get it, we'll do something with it and we'll share it and make sure people are seeing, but we haven't got it yet. And it's really great. We've had a little sneak preview of it and it's going to be really good. The one thing that I am just going to put up in front of you as a more general kind of thing to be thinking about when it comes to the differences across places, we can cut this data by deprivations, so by indices of multiple deprivation. And when we do it like that, what we see is that within the most deprived parts of the city, 1 in 3 adults are inactive. And when you look at that compared to the wealthiest, the least deprived parts of the city, it's 1 in 5. Okay, that's a big difference. And we know there's a lot of factors at play in this, like access to green spaces, connectivity to public transport infrastructure, so on and so on and so forth. And that picture, building that picture up, is still really important to do. That's my summary. I'm not going to go over all that again because I've just said it, hopefully. But I just thought I'd capture all the points on one slide, so you can you can use that as you wish. And hopefully there's some really helpful data in here. There's the last 2 things that I'm just going to show, and then I'll stop and you can ask me any questions you like. I just thought we'd turn that demographic groups data into numbers for you, so you can just see this is across the whole of the city. Just starts to show you the biggest groups when it comes to inactivity. Look at that NSSEC 6 to 8 that falls between men and women as the biggest group. If you look at NSSEC 3 and 5 to 3 to 5 and 1 to 2 and add them together, you still don't get as many inactive people as you get in NSSEC 6 to 8. So we really do need to build a better understanding of our lower income communities, the kind of work they're doing and the impact that has on their activity routines and their perceptions of being active, and how that interplays with the environment that they live in. There's a whole space there that I think needs better evidence than we currently have available to us, or that I'm aware of for sure. The last thing that I'm going to leave you with is a little bit of learning that's coming out. I mentioned this National Evaluation Learning Partnership that Sport England have been working with for the last 5 years around some of their investments into local delivery pilots. And it's a really interesting bit of work that's learning work that's coming out from them around the kind of things that we need to be thinking about, and then the conditions, the things that we need to be thinking about changing. There's a lot more to it than this slide. I was only just putting this slide up to kind of whet the appetite for those of you that are interested to go and maybe find out a bit more about it. You can find some great videos online of Katie Shern presenting it and explaining it. It's come from quite a rigorous piece of work just to explain these 3 things that Katie talks at here. She talks about, the need to integrate physical activity across public sectors, across our daily lives and environments. She talks about building on strengths, the need to strengthen communities and individual capacities to be active, to be able to create change. And then she talks about the need to tackle structural inequalities. You can see that in some of the data that I've just presented, that we've got some deep structural inequalities holding some of those differences in place. Okay. And then the bit that I really like about this is, as you go down from top to bottom, the ease of implementation gets harder, but the potential for impact gets bigger. And I just thought I'd put this up there as, to help you think, well, actually, how do we collaborate in this space? How do we work together to connect things up? What is our work to build capabilities and capacities in our communities? What does that look like? And what is it? And what influence can we have over over tackling structural inequalities, because at the heart of some of those groups that I've highlighted today, they're the things that are holding things, inactivity in place, and it's what we need to work on trying to change. I'm done. Hopefully I haven't overrun. Nick.
Thanks, Scott. That was really appreciated. Opening the floor to ask questions of Scott whilst we've got him. Seeing if I've got any hands popping up or.
I'm used to this,
Yeah,
Nick. I'm used to scaring people into silence.
Lucy.
Lucy. You're on mute, Lucy, if you're speaking.
Trying. There we go.
Hi.
Sorry, it was taking its time. Thank you. I work for an organisation, a charity that does a lot of gardening activities. So I'd be interested in any more that you could tell us about the role of gardening and how that was something you mentioned specifically.
Yeah, well, okay, so gardening is really important. Okay, roughly, this is off the top of my head, it's roughly about 20% of minutes nationally. 17 to it's a similar size to all the minutes from traditional sport. And traditional sports, all your football, all your cricket, all your rugby, all your tennis, all of that, all your canoeing, all of that is traditional sport. And running and swimming in traditional sport, and gardening is nearly the similar size to it. So it's important. It's particularly important for older people, people with a limited illness and disability, in particular, two groups. So there's a really interesting slide that we did a few years ago about walking for travel, walking for leisure, and gardening minutes. And basically, walking for travel minutes start high, i.e. young adults, and then around the age of mid to late 20s, they start to drop off a cliff. Why? We get enough income and buy a car. Okay, it's pretty straightforward. And you can see it in the walking for travel minutes. Okay, what happens with walking for leisure? They start kind of low, and then they stay fairly low, and then get about 30, and they start going up, and they peak around 70. Basically, as we get older, particularly white British people, we stop playing sport, we start walking with the family, going out for walks. Gardening it starts very low. Younger adults do very little. Of course they don't, living in flats potentially, or living still at home, and it's the parents that are doing the gardening, whatever the situation is. And then it gets to middle age, or maybe 35-ish, and it starts to go up, and then it goes up and it peaks at about 75, something like that. Home ownership. I'm falling into this. I moved from London 8 years ago. I did not do a single minute gardening. I ended up renting a house with a garden and thinking, oh, I've got to mow the lawn. Hold on a minute. I've got and it's forced upon you in the sense of, that kind of traditional stereotypical concept of white British people progressing in their lives, going from living in flats to getting a house, renting, buying a house, and then all of a sudden finding themselves at gardening. Gardening makes up a lot of minutes for people over the age of 55. It really does. And so it's really important. We can get some data on it. We've got a chart like this, which I can probably get somebody to send over to Nick, so you've got it, and it's got all of the activities on, which includes gardening, and you can see what's happened to the average minutes from gardening over time, which, if that would be helpful.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Julie.
Hiya. This is really informative, really helpful. Now, from all this data, have you got anything where there's ideas where you can get all these people involved in all these activities, and any mapping of all these sports and activities that can be passed on to all these people that are inactive?
Okay, let's start with the mapping side of it. We haven't got. This is a good question for Katie Crockett. If we're still recording, Nick, then we could pick that up with Sharon. Katie Active Not has been doing some work with an organisation called the Open Data Initiative. Sounds a bit fancy, but what they're trying to do is they're trying to build a database of all the activities that exist across the country, and they're trying to connect them into one place so that we can basically use that data to promote it. I know Katie's been doing some work with that organisation, but I don't know where it's got to. That's my best answer in terms of that whole provision. We do some mapping work for Active Knots, but we're more at mapping things like where different groups live. So where are our culturally diverse communities? Where are our lower socioeconomic communities? Where are people living with a long-term illness or disability? So we do some mapping work like that. We haven't done anything in terms of mapping provision over the top of that, outside of things that Active Knots have invested in. So they've got some maps with around like where investment for opening schools funding has gone, or where the tackling inequalities funding has gone. So there's some things like that, but not that provision mapping. But it's probably worth us picking up with Katie whether there's anything happened on that open data initiative piece of work. On your first bit around things that will make a difference, the work that Katie Shearn is leading has got a lot more detail to it than I've presented on this today, and so I would encourage you to have a look at that. I think the thing with it is it's not just about provision, it's about thinking about how we work and about how we connect with and influence people that can influence some of those other influences that I mentioned at the beginning. So for example, what on earth am I on about? Think active travel. Okay, think of all of the things that prevent or enable people to use their feet or wheels to get to and from places. And if we really want to increase activity levels, remember that walking is 50% of minutes. If we want to increase activity levels, walking plays a really big role in it. And part of that is walking for leisure and encouraging people to maybe join walking groups and help them move a little bit and helping them get, deal with isolation, whatever it is. But part of that's joining places up, getting people using public transport, getting people out of the car. And so to do that, we've got to influence the people that are making the decisions that build the transport infrastructure. So that learning, the current best learning in that space is expressed by Katie's work.
Okay, thank you.
Get a request in, Jules.
Well, yeah, the next thing is, how do we get hold of Katie? Crocking,
Well,
is it? Regarding her mapping?
I can circulate some videos, and then I think it would be worth having a conversation with Sharon if at some point you want to try and, I know that Katie is currently supporting some work that's happening and the different active partnerships across the country are going along to it. I don't know if other partners are getting involved in it. I'm sure they probably are. So I think there is something to be, pick up with Sharon there around what's the opportunity to do that further down the line.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Julie. Amanda.
Thanks, Nick.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello. Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Sorry, I had a bit of a Wi-Fi crisis partway through what you were saying and lost a bit in the middle and couldn't get back in. So I'm sorry if you've already said this. So we deliver dance to people with long-term mental and physical conditions from sort of 18 up to sort of 103 years in age. We do it 3 times a week for 50 minutes. We are about to run out of funding in 3 weeks, and we haven't been able to secure any more, but we have got some at the moment from Sport England. So the 150-minute thing that you mentioned and the intensity, presumably that intensity is appropriate intensity for the individual.
Yes.
Yeah. So if it's seated but definitely exercise, an increase of heart rate, an increase of movement.
Yes.
That would be. I'm just thinking because I'm literally writing a couple of bits at the minute. That 150-minute target, that's recognised. That's what we're looking for as a kind of a baseline. And as long as it's appropriate.
Yeah, it is, Amanda. But I would think a little bit. I don't know whether you heard me say this. Any movement is better than none. Okay. Yeah. And so when we're starting to think about people that might be taking place in chair-based exercise, where that exercise is going to get their heart rate up, those minutes are absolutely going to count. This isn't about getting them to 150. This is about getting them to do as much as they can. And it's and the first goal for me is let's get them out of doing less than 30. You know, if you're thinking about positioning your funding bid, my view would be, if you can reach people that are doing less than 30 minutes, that we know are not doing a lot of movement, they're maybe isolated, let's just get them doing something, and then let's try and get them over the 30 minutes, okay, and out of the inactive. That's our first starting point, because we know that the biggest benefits from a health perspective and from a mental well-being perspective is getting those that are doing nothing doing something.
Yeah. Well, I don't have any trouble finding people because Julie Ellen does that for me. Match made in heaven.
Yeah.
And I was going to ask you one other really quick thing. Sorry, I don't want to monopolise you. Now I forgot what it is. Sorry. Are we going to have these slides? Because when the recording started, it ejected me and I couldn't get back in. Nick's already got the slides, which you can absolutely share, and there's a version of them on Active Knots website as well, and we'll share the recording. The other bit that I will try and get a colleague to send over to Nick so he can circulate it is this I mentioned this chart. We can get this chart and we can put dancing on there. Okay, the minutes from dancing will be tiny, okay, but at least you'll get a sense of the pattern in it, okay, because it's dwarfed by other activities. You won't be able to do that much analysis of dance minutes in Nottingham, because when it comes to a population level survey like this, just the number of respondents that say that the dance will be really quite small, so you can't really analyze it in any kind of way. If you wanted to do anything around that, the best way to do it would probably be to look at Sport England have an Active Lives diagnostic tool where you can explore this data, and you can probably pick dance. I don't know this off the top of my head because I haven't been on it for quite a while, because we play with a raw data set, but you can probably identify at a national level kind of who dances, what kind of demographic, what kind of people say that they do dancing minutes, which might help you with your work. Yeah, that's lovely. We've had 500 in the last 11 months throughout.
Wow, brilliant.
February the 6th last year, yeah. So we just did our stats the other day. So 500 people have accessed over 3,000.
And again, there's a demographic group that is drawn to dance that would be quite interesting to try and understand. Because we know that some of those groups are more likely to be inactive.
Brilliant, that's great. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And my dogs didn't bark the whole way through that, so that's a win.
Appeared on camera. Thanks. Anybody else for questions for Scott before we let him? He's got to get to Exeter, so any more questions? I think you're good to go, Scott. Thank you so much for giving us that presentation. As I say, Scott has sent the presentation over, so that will come out with the actions hopefully tomorrow to you. And anything else that Scott gets sent with Active Knots, we'll get that straight out to everybody on the call. So yeah, thank you, Scott. Very much appreciated.
All right, thanks all.
Hand us up.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Oh, Amanda, did you want Scott before he went?
Oh.
No, just a hands away bit. There we go. You're good to go, Scott. Thank you.
Right, see you. Bye. Bye.
Brilliant. Let me, I can stop the camera recording as well. We don't need that anymore. There we go. Lovely. Stop.